I'd like to introduce my colleague who's here at the National Museum of the United States Army in the Programs and Education Division, Caitlin Healy. She's an education specialist here at the museum. She received a Bachelor of Arts in History from Fairfield University and a Master of Arts in Museum Studies from Marist College. Prior to the National Army Museum, she worked as the Director of Education at the Lyman Allyn Art Museum in New London, Connecticut. So please welcome Caitlin Healy.
Good morning, late morning, everyone. As John said, my name is Caitlin Healy, and I'm an educator here at the National Army Museum. Thank you for joining me for my talk, Lincoln's Army. In this presentation, we are going to look at three things. First, we will look at President Lincoln's view of soldiers and the Army in general. Spoiler alert, big fan, he really liked them. Secondly, we will examine soldiers' views on Lincoln during the war. And then thirdly, we're going to look at soldiers' views on the Emancipation Proclamation. We're going to look at men who supported it, men who did not like it, and some men in between. The motto of the National Museum of the United States Army is that every soldier has a story. Every soldier. Yes, it is easier to find information on the Grants, the Shermans, and the McClellans of history. They were tactical and logistical geniuses who have rightfully earned their place in the history books. But what would those military giants have been without the men that they commanded? Where would Lincoln have been without these men during the election of 1864? We will focus on the average Joe soldier's thoughts, feelings, and opinions, using the letters that they sent home, the diaries they kept with them, and the memoirs they wrote later. We are going to trace how Civil War soldiers saw the world around them at the time when they were fighting for their country's survival. So let's begin. When you look at this image and you think about Abraham Lincoln, many words, emotions might instantly come to mind to describe the type of man that he was. Fair, empathetic, honest, father, uncle, charismatic, modest, sincere. These words are part of the reason Lincoln's legacy has endured in the 158 years since his assassination. What might not immediately come to mind is Lincoln's military experience. And that makes sense. Lincoln didn't have the extensive military background that a lot of our presidents have had. You know, he's certainly no George Washington. A lot of people either don't know or tend to overlook that Lincoln did serve, albeit briefly. He was a member of the Illinois militia for 3 months during the Black Hawk War in 1832, as our director Tammy Call mentioned in her opening remarks. And this service left a deep imprint on him, although in true Lincoln fashion, he humorously downplayed it by saying, "I fought, bled, and came away. I had a good many bloody struggles with the mosquitoes." Lincoln was 23 during the Black Hawk War, and his time in the militia brought with it what military service brings to most young people who serve: a sense of direction, a sense of purpose, camaraderie, oftentimes much needed structure and discipline. His life up until this point has been described as aimless. You know, he didn't have a proper conventional education. He had moved around quite a bit. And his career had kind of been a bit of a roller coaster. He hadn't been totally successful. Regardless of all of that, the men of the New Salem, Illinois militia immediately recognized something within Lincoln, and they elected him their captain of their unit. They found him to be trustworthy. They thought he was capable, and he was seen as someone who didn't back away from a challenge. William G. Greene, a private in the New Salem militia and a lifelong friend of Lincoln's, recalled that the consensus among all of the men was that there was no question about it. Abe was altogether the best man for captain. 26 years later, in December of 1859, Lincoln writes his own recollections of being made captain. It's a surprise to him, but it's also a point of pride. And it was a success that gave him more pleasure than any he had had since. And there he is. This is his muster roll, and he is right at the top, Abraham Lincoln, captain. While he and the men of New Salem never saw any action, that doesn't mean that they didn't see or feel the effects of the war. They marched for hundreds of miles in the northern part of Illinois, even going into Wisconsin territory. They experienced exhaustion, fatigue. They dealt with mosquitoes, more often than which gave them malaria. So they're getting very, very sick. There's a lack of food. There's a lack of water. And they're also dealing with inclement weather. There's a lot of quotes from Lincoln talking about how he remembers trying to sleep in mud. And they saw the horrific results of the battles and skirmishes that took place during the war. And they actually did help bury some of those who had died. And that's the quote that's reflected on your screen. Lincoln's initial 30-day enlistment period came to an end in May, but he so enjoyed his time in the militia that he ended up re-enlisting 2 more times, finally mustering out of service in July of 1832. When he re-enlisted for the first time, he was given the oath of service by then Lieutenant Robert Anderson, who would later command Fort Sumter at the start of the Civil War. His time in the militia gave Lincoln a much-needed boost in confidence. He starts to come into his own during this time. He was able to experience the effects of war firsthand. He learned the inner workings and structure of the military, how much training, how much discipline is required. And this would prove to be beneficial during his time in office. Fast forward to his presidency, and Lincoln's admiration for those who served their country in the armed forces can best be described through a speech he gave during the closing of a sanitary fair in Washington, D.C. In it, he says, "For it has been said, all that a man hath will he give for his life, and while all contribute of their substance, the soldier puts his life at stake and often yields it up for his country's cause. The highest merit, then, is due to the soldier." With that in mind, what did soldiers think of Lincoln? He was, for the most part, popular with Union soldiers. I'm not going to say he was beloved by all, but he was, for the most part, popular. And there are several reasons for that, actually. The first being that he was seen as a nice man. He was seen as someone who was approachable. He was someone that they could easily talk to once they got over the fact that they were speaking with the President of the United States, which is why I like this image so much. He was very evident to the soldiers who met him that he genuinely wanted to hear their stories and to learn about their experiences. Noah Brooks, who ended up being a longtime friend of Lincoln's, was a correspondent for the Sacramento Union, and he spent the majority of the war in Washington at the White House. So he's seeing a lot of these interactions that Lincoln is having with soldiers. And he remembered that Lincoln's manner towards these often enlisted men was always delightful in its absolute freedoms from anything like condescension. Then at least the common soldier was the equal of the chief magistrate of the nation. Brooks recalled a specific meeting in March of 1863 when Lincoln met with 6 men from an Ohio regiment who had just received the Medal of Honor. And upon meeting these men, he shook their hands, he listened to their stories intently, he asked them questions. And it's evident, according to Brooks, who saw this interaction, that this interesting interview was to him of supreme importance. Afterwards, Lincoln spoke about this meeting, and he said that their bearing and their apparent unconsciousness of having taken their lives in their hands with the chances of death all against them presented an example which was so strong a characteristic of the American soldier. So this knowledge that Lincoln was friendly and the idea that he could be friends with the common soldier was not only felt by the men who knew the president personally, but by those who only ever saw him in passing. One of Lincoln's bodyguards, a soldier named Robert McBride, commented that Lincoln would often go amongst the men and chat with them and had this kind of familial relationship with them. And he wanted to know what they thought about the war from their point of view. They're the ones in the field doing the fighting, and he wants to know how they see the war going. He was genuine, he was kind, and he was interested in them. Felix Brannigan, who was part of the 74th New York Infantry, saw Lincoln in Virginia in July of 1862, and he wrote home to his family in Pennsylvania. And he said, Lincoln, we are all convinced, is a soldier's friend and the man above all men in the right place. We felt that he takes an interest in us. Talk of McClellan's popularity among soldiers, it will never measure 1/100th part of Honest Abe's. And that's pretty extraordinary because McClellan is wildly popular among his men and the men in the army. But to Brannigan, he doesn't hold a flame to Lincoln's popularity. It's been estimated that Lincoln had private audiences with approximately 2,000 soldiers. That's less than 0.5% of all Union forces. So he's not meeting a lot of them, but stories, news, gossip spreads throughout the federal army. And it gets out that the President of the United States, their commander-in-chief, who has to make these massive decisions that could impact their lives and could impact their families' lives, is making the time to meet with men just like them. And that makes Lincoln quickly rise in esteem. The second reason Lincoln was popular was that it was clear that he cared about the men in the army. He cared about their well-being. This is evident in the numerous hospital visits he would make throughout his presidency, as well as his habitual pardoning of soldiers for court-martialed offenses, something that drove the higher-ups in the army crazy. William E. Doster, a Union officer stationed in Washington, stationed at the hospitals in Washington, remembered that he often saw the president going through the wards, giving a kind word to one man, a cheerful message to another, and it was impossible not to be convinced that the suffering and tragedies of this great struggle touched a tender chord in his nature, very much as an affectionate father would feel that in his own family. So now you're kind of getting the sense of why he's having these nicknames of Father Abraham and Uncle Abe. He has this family type relationship again with these men. And I think it's understandable why Lincoln would visit these local hospitals so often. The consequences of his decisions and his generals' decisions are filling the thousands of hospital beds throughout Washington and indeed the country. Lincoln is often called an enigma when it came to being able to hide his emotions. He was an expert at it, but it's also well known that Lincoln could be emotional, and he was someone who felt quite deeply. And it's most evident when he is visiting the hospitals and when he's issuing pardons. John Eaton, a chaplain in the 27th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, was at the White House one day visiting with Lincoln when army executions were taking place in Virginia, and they could hear the gunshots across the river. And he said that Lincoln went to the window and that when he turned back around, there were tears running down his face. "I am wondering," said Lincoln, "whether I have used the pardoning power as much as I ought. I know some of our officers feel that I have used it with so much freedom as to demoralize the army and destroy the discipline." I was unable to find a concrete number of pardons that Lincoln issued on behalf of court-martialed soldiers, but I do know that it was enough to rankle army officials and those within his cabinet. This doesn't mean that Lincoln is handing out pardons like Skittles. He's not handing them out left and right. There are some crimes that Lincoln finds unpardonable, and he has no problem letting those punishments go forward. But the majority of his pardons tended to go to young men who are often in their teens, men whose families would be left destitute, only sons and such. And surprisingly, at least to me, men who had fallen asleep on duty. And he spoke about his views on the latter, and I'm paraphrasing while the full quote is on your screen. Lincoln knows that falling asleep on duty is bad. He knows it's bad. He knows it's endangering the lives of many more men. Rules in the army are black and white, and that makes sense. You have to hold everyone to the same standard. But to Lincoln, sometimes those rules are gray. He feels that there can be extenuating circumstances. And he goes on to say that he would not relax the discipline of the Army, but that he wants to be considerate of every case. And he is considerate of every case. He spends hours reviewing court-martial cases and pardoning cases. Something that also impacted his decision were the thousands of letters that he receives from wives and mothers across the country, imploring him to show mercy to their loved ones. Mrs. Eliza J. Stevens of Seymour, Indiana, wrote to Lincoln in the spring of 1862 on behalf of her 16-year-old son, Benjamin, who had been caught asleep on guard duty. And she's asking him to please show mercy. There's no record, I couldn't find a record of Lincoln responding to Mrs. Stevens or any evidence that he actually intervened in this particular case, but I was able to find this record of Company B from The Ohio State University, which seems to be very popular today. And all the way down at the bottom, highlighted in orange, you can see that Private Benjamin F. Stevens mustered out of service on November 29th, 1864. So whatever punishment he was originally given, it clearly was not the ultimate punishment, which was to be executed. Many of those who worked closely with the president commented quite often on his hatred of bloodshed. Lincoln is very disturbed by how bloody the war is becoming, and if he could spare just one unnecessary drop of blood from being shed, he was going to do it. John Eaton summed up his feelings on Lincoln's pardoning tendencies by saying that for a man so relentless with himself in the performance of his own duty, Lincoln's charity towards others was little short of phenomenal. The third reason soldiers became fiercely loyal to Lincoln was that his views on the war were similar to their own. As war is breaking out, the emphasis from both Lincoln and the men who are enlisting was the preservation of the Union. But as the war progressed together, their focus starts to shift, specifically towards Black Americans and their place within the armed forces and American society as a whole. When Lincoln first came to office, he made it explicitly clear that his only goal was to preserve the Union. In his inaugural address on March 4th, 1861, he stated that he had no intention of interfering with the institution of slavery in states where it did exist. And this is something Northern men could relate to. Lincoln's hope was to try to avoid war at all costs, but of course it becomes clear that that's unavoidable. After the attack on Fort Sumter, when Lincoln first calls for 75,000 men, someone who signed up right away was James Caldwell. He became a captain in Company A of the 36th Pennsylvania Infantry, and his sole focus and desire was this reunification of the Union. His wife, Anne, however, had more Southern sympathies. We are very lucky in that there are 182 letters surviving between them. And in these letters, James explains his reasons for joining the Army. By the way, he joins the Army without discussing it with his wife first. Gentlemen in the room and online, I cannot emphasize enough, don't do that. Don't do that, because they pretty much spend 182 letters going back and forth about how she is not happy with him. So if you get a chance to read those letters, please do. She's feisty. In a letter dated July 4th, 1861, he tells Anne that he joined the Army with good intentions, and yet another excuse to have her stop yelling at him. He is fighting to protect the government. He has no quarrel with the South, indicating that for him, this war isn't about freedom for enslaved people. It wouldn't have mattered who had become president. He says even Jefferson Davis could have been elected and he still would have joined. So his loyalty is to the Union. His loyalty is not to Lincoln. Anne, on the other hand, is dubious about the whole thing. She basically thinks it's a giant conspiracy theory that's been concocted between Lincoln and Jefferson. It has no merit. She thinks the whole thing is kind of a farce. And while Lincoln doesn't seem enthralled, or while James doesn't seem enthralled with Lincoln, She doesn't think the president is capable of bringing about the war's end. This war was only supposed to last 3 months. 3 months have passed. The war's still going on. He's clearly not capable. In response to Anne questioning Lincoln's capabilities, we see that James kind of changes his tune. On November 11th, 1861, he defends Lincoln. He says he is the only man for this job. And he ends the letter to his wife saying, "And if he finishes as he has begun, history will pronounce him one of the ablest and best presidents we have ever had," which kind of foreshadows how we see Lincoln now. Tensions between Union soldiers and their Confederate sympathizing family members are common. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of these letters between Union soldiers defending Lincoln, defending the war's cause, and their opposing family members. In a letter to his Democrat voting father, George Oscar French of the 11th Vermont Volunteers writes that he's one of Lincoln's minions, and he's ready to lose his life in the holy cause of exterminating Old Success wherever it is to be found. But remember, Old Success, he says nothing about abolition or emancipation. However, the war goes on for a lot longer than anyone originally anticipated. And as it continues, and as the loss of life reaches these staggering numbers, and the morale of the Union Army begins to drop, the tide starts to turn from this patriotic idealism of saving the Union to the fact that the war started because Southern states had refused to free enslaved people. The men of the Union Army are fighting, they are dying, they are contracting horrible diseases, they are suffering life-altering injuries because of slavery. As history has moved on from the Civil War, this narrative that the South is immoral, racist, slave owners has kind of taken hold, while the North is viewed as more tolerant and just and protective of Black Americans. This couldn't be farther from the truth. There are horrifically racist people in Northern states. There are horrifically racist men in the Union Army. But what I think is important to highlight is that there is a change in the opinions of many Union soldiers towards Black Americans the more they interacted with enslaved men and women and saw the horror that was being inflicted on these innocent people firsthand. One such story of a change in perception and opinion is that of Felix Brannigan, who we had looked at earlier. Brannigan might have been a fan of Lincoln, but he's not a fan of the idea of Black men being allowed to join the Army in combat positions. He wrote home to his sister in the summer of 1862, and he said that if these rumors are true, if Lincoln is going to allow Black men to join the Army to fight, then Brannigan wants out. He doesn't want to have anything to do with fighting side by side with Black men. He says that as a white man, he and his fellow soldiers are too superior of a race for that. Ooh. There we go. Despite his feelings, Brannigan doesn't leave the Army when Lincoln allowed Black men to fight in 1863. In fact, by the end of the war, he seems to have done a 180. In December of 1864, he was a second lieutenant with the 32nd USCT, United States Colored Troop. And by the end of the war, he's a first lieutenant with the 103rd USCT. Considering the dangers of being in a USCT unit, considering how Confederate soldiers bragged in their letters home about the cruelty that they had inflicted or were planning on inflicting on USCT men and the white officers who led them into battle, this is a pretty extraordinary turnaround. Brannigan survived the war, and he's buried here in Virginia. He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. And his gravestone is marked with his service in the 103rd so that anyone who comes across it knows that he served alongside Black soldiers. Lincoln's view on Black Americans and allowing Black men in the Army wasn't such a quick turnaround. His views and his actions very much have a politician's tone to them. He was never a supporter of slavery, as indicated by this quote, but he's not an abolitionist either. He went into politics thinking that Black and white Americans were not equal. He doesn't see Black Americans as an intrinsic part of mainstream, AKA white society. As president, however, he is interacting with freedmen and abolitionists more. He is being bombarded by Black Americans through letters, in newspaper articles, and in private audiences. He has a fascinating one with Frederick Douglass in August of 1863, asking him to free enslaved people and to allow Black men to serve in the army. And he's coming to this realization that they could play a vital role in shortening the war. And this brings us to the Emancipation Proclamation. Following the success at Antietam in September of 1862, Lincoln felt that the tides of war were finally turning in the Union's favor. Now, he decides, is the time to truly undercut Southern momentum. Issued in September of 1862 and going into effect on 1 January 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation is a document of war. And it is a document of war that, when read through, is actually very limited in what it does. It only frees enslaved people from Southern states, so it leaves slavery intact in the border states. And so it's seen as more of a temporary fix, in that Lincoln has to win the war, or win the election of 1864, and the North has to win the war in order for this proclamation to stick. This in turn is why Lincoln had to push through, once he did win the election, had to push through the passing of the 13th Amendment in April of 1864. Rumors of the proclamation had been circulating for months, and reactions within the Army were pretty mixed. Some men were immediately for it. Levi Hines of the 11th Vermont wrote that the late proclamation of the president makes it a war on slavery, fighting for the purpose of ending this hellish curse of our country. And Henry F. Holes of the 11th Illinois stated that he was for the proclamation teeth and toenails, because it's right, it is necessary, it is expedient, it is just, and it is what the whole civilized world expects us to do. Other men eventually come around to the idea that freeing enslaved people was the best way forward. Alfonso Bardo wrote to his father and said that he didn't join the war with any sort of abolition tendencies. He thought that the Union needed to enforce the fugitive slave law. But again, he's seeing these effects. He's seeing slavery firsthand. He's seeing the effects it has on people. And it's a curse. It's a curse on this country that needs to be eliminated. Can it be wrong in any light to blot out an institution blacker than the fines of hell? And then there are the men who remain steadfast in their hatred of Black Americans. Henry P. Hubble of the 3rd New York Volunteers was an anti-secessionist Democrat in the Union Army. And his letters home give a fascinating insight into what many men, because there are many men in the Army like him, thought about what was going on. A few weeks after the proclamation went into effect, he sends a letter home in which he states that he's disgusted with both Lincoln and the government. He's writing to his brother in this letter, he didn't join the Army for this. He's not fighting on behalf of freedom for enslaved people. He wants them to remain enslaved. He wants any Black American who's free to go into slavery. And he's very angry that when the war has gone on for so long and so many have died, that this is what Lincoln and the government are choosing to care about. And he goes on to criticize the president and accuse him of not being honest and overreaching his executive powers. And he's so angry about this that he ends up resigning his commission in May of 1863, and he leaves the Army. He wants nothing to do with this. He's washing his hands of the Civil War. And he represents he represents many men and how they felt. there's open talk among men about not only deserting the Army, but even joining Confederate forces because of the Emancipation Proclamation. And Lincoln hears these grumbles, and he decides to respond to these men by taking them through his thought process regarding the proclamation and how he came about to enacting it. This is something that he thought about for a long time before he chose to move forward with it. And he knew that many people wouldn't like it in and out of the Army. But he decides to move forward with it for two reasons. The primary reason is that it brings freedom to upwards of, he says, 6 million people. In actuality, it was probably closer to 4 million. But it brings freedom to upwards of 6 million people. And that is one of his primary focuses going forward. The second reason is that he is convinced it is a way in which the Union can shorten the war. As we discussed earlier, Lincoln is seeing the catastrophic results of war firsthand, and he's getting the casualty lists from his generals. He's a smart man. He knows how to count. He knows how to add. And he sees how determined the South is to stay in the fight. So how can he, as commander-in-chief, not take an opportunity to undermine the South, which could, in the long run, save hundreds of thousands of Union lives? And there's evidence that the men in the field agreed with Lincoln's take on the proclamation. These are two letters from soldiers who wrote home to their hometown newspapers. One was an anonymous letter from an Illinois cavalryman, and the other was James K. Wells of Indiana. But they basically both say, if we free the slaves, Southern men have to go home. They have to take care of their families. Someone has to feed them. And if they don't have slaves anymore, they have to farm their land, and they have to be the ones responsible for taking care of their families. And that the South has had enough time to solve this problem and has chosen not to. So the fault really lies with them. However, who better to speak on behalf of those most affected by the proclamation than a person of color? Hannah Johnson was the mother of a 54th Massachusetts USCT soldier who had fought in the Second Battle of Fort Wagner on July 18th, 1863. And he survives the battle. And she writes to Lincoln at the end of July. And the letter as a whole is very moving and is very emotionally charged. But I'm only going to concentrate on the latter portion of it because that's where she talks about the proclamation. The full quote, of course, is on the screen. But in this section, she's talking about how she's hearing rumors that due to the kind of vitriolic response of the proclamation, that Lincoln might rescind it. And she's asking him not to. The people of the South have, for generations, lived off the backs of the enslaved. The institution of slavery, for which the South is so reliant, has robbed millions of people of their lives, and not just their lives, but their souls. And slavery has stolen their past, and she's asking Lincoln to please not let it steal their future. She goes on to say that the South cannot be allowed to complain about she goes on to say that the South cannot be allowed to complain about things they've stolen being taken away from them because it should never have been allowed to have been theirs to steal in the first place. They have no foot to stand on. And I think Private Ransom Bedell of the 39th Infantry expressed it perfectly when he said, "We are not for the Union as it was, but as it will be." Hurrah for A. Lincoln. The United States cannot go backwards. The only way is forward, and the only way is to go forward without slavery. Lincoln's first term in office was tumultuous, to say the least. A civil war, devastating loss of life, and then the daunting task of rebuilding, healing, and coming together again as a united country. But the Emancipation Proclamation was at the heart of what he felt he did right in his first term. I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right. I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper. If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it. So the Lincoln that we saw in the 1858 quote with his debate with Stephen Douglas is not the Lincoln of 1863. The president is evidence that men can change and that their opinions can evolve for the better. And he and most of the men in the Union Army seem to do this evolving together. We have covered quite a bit in this talk, and we really only skimmed the surface. But if I have piqued your interest into the minds of ordinary Civil War soldiers and their families, then I have done my job as an educator. The title of this talk was How Lincoln Inspired and Motivated Soldiers, but I think it's safe to say that soldiers inspired and motivated Lincoln just as much. The mutual trust, respect, and admiration they had for each other is evident throughout the war in the words they left behind for us to read. Thank you all so much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have at this.
This is more of a statement than it is a question. You talk about Lincoln as in 58 being different than the president in 63. But in Lincoln's defense, he was still a politician talking to a group of people who were, by most part, racist. And I think for him to have taken that stand in 58 would have been disastrous for the Republican Party.
Oh, absolutely. He's trying to win an election.
Yeah.
He's trying to win an election. But these are his thoughts, and he does speak quite often. I just chose a debate quote. So his perception does evolve over time. But yes, you're absolutely right. He is trying to win an election. It's interesting, when I was reading these letters, the only thing that Union soldiers at the start of the war seemed to hate more than secessionists were abolitionists. So, it's a game of chess. He's trying to see, what he can do when he can do it. But, you're absolutely right.
Great presentation. Thank you very much. The best quote I think I've seen about the Emancipation Proclamation was, it may have been limited in scope, but revolutionary in impact. And I think the so what of that, and you alluded to it in your presentation, that the nation would not go back, that, the nation after the Emancipation Proclamation was a different nation. And enslaved people played a role in freeing themselves.
Yes.
So it was not just a matter of the federal government. But it's really hard to figure out exactly what Lincoln thought. I mean, because when he actually, as I understand it, wrote the Emancipation Proclamation in the summer of 1862. So, the famous Forrest Greeley letter that I think it's in August of 1862, where he says that, if he could save the Union by freeing some, or he'd already written the Emancipation Proclamation. Right. And at the Battle of Antietam, he was waiting for a victory. And I guess the other point is that it wasn't all Lincoln, that Congress also plays a role in the Emancipation Proclamation and the role of African Americans in the war.
Yeah,
so comments.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Caitlin, very much. We appreciate it.